attended a conference a few years ago, and it was an energy conference. And interestingly, they had the head of the RCMP there. And, most people would not tie in those two things together, but they were there talking about some of the things we're talking about domestic terrorism, about, there's groups out there that are domestically trying to, let's say, destroy infrastructure like pipelines. And it's a big, it was a big deal to them back then. Mm-hmm. Is there still a lot more of that? Like we recently saw a few months ago where at the site of that, the coastal gas link. And we saw that, they were really, that was some serious stuff that happened there. Where, they caused millions of dollars worth of damage. And one person was almost injured really badly because of the attack with axes. Yeah. We don't see that there's been no leads and there's been no arrests even made. And, we could talk about the public perception or the kind of confidence that Canadians that decreases when they see that kind of stuff happens. But is there still a lot of that happening right now domestically, especially towards our energy sector? Where do you think that's coming from? Where's all this, hatred, or where's all this misinformation, you can also say? Where's it all coming from? And is this something you saw regularly?
I'm really glad you raised that one, Jas, because I've been asking myself the same question. So for those who weren't aware, I think it was back in April, if memory serves me correct, there was an attack, or maybe it was late March, on a coastal gas camp in British Columbia in the early hours of the morning, 1 or 2 a.m. About 40 people, masked people came up. As you said, they had axes. They did several $1 million worth of damage. They burned some equipment. I believe the people were inside and had to get out. As you said, no one died, thankfully. We got a splash on the CBC and then crickets. Nothing was said about it. So who were these people? Well, I don't know them by name, but I would go on a limb and say they were one of two groups, or perhaps two groups cooperating. They were probably environmental extremists who were against the any attempt to use fossil fuels in the 21st century, or they were First Nation extremists who wanted to protest land use or something. The bottom line, Jas, is that under the Canadian Criminal Code, Section 83.01, that was an act of terrorism. Because it was a serious act of violence carried out for an ideological, political, or religious cause. Now, I don't know who the actors were, but you don't go and attack a coastal gas thing at 2 o'clock in the morning, fully masked up, doing damage if you don't have some kind of political message in mind. This wasn't 40 guys on a bender having drank too many beers saying, well, let's go and attack this camp kind of thing. What dismayed me was the lack of coverage. Now, I don't know. I'm sure the RCMP and E Division is looking into it. And of course, they're not going to be able to tell us anything until they find some evidence they can lay charges. But what really bothered me was the lack of response from the Trudeau government. And I don't want to go all conspiracy theory on you here, but had that attack been carried out by a guy yelling Allahu Akbar or a guy wearing a swastika, that would have been front page news for a month. And the fact that it looks like it was either an environmental extremist or possibly a First Nations extremist that carried it out, and we've heard nothing about it, speaks volumes about what this government considers to be threats to national security and public safety. And that really worries me as a former CSIS guy, because that, when the government decides that we're only going to care about this form of extremism and not the other forms of extremism, what do you do when you work for the security service? Does it make you want to investigate less those forms for fear that the government's not going to welcome the information that you provide with them? Intelligence service and law enforcement are by definition and should be at arm's length from the government of the day. Because in a worst case scenario, it has to investigate the government of the day, depending if there are allegations that some kind of crime has been committed. So it does really bother me that the message coming out from this current government is that only certain things are worth talking about. And, that was a heinous act of violence, which thankfully didn't result in any deaths, but it very much could have. And the fact that, as you said, there's been no reflection on that. So we looked at left-wing extremism when I was at CSIS. And again, I don't want to overplay this, because just like the jihadis, the vast majority of people that write things online and post things on platforms never do anything about it. The challenge we find is, how do you find the onesies and twosies, the 1 in 1,000, that's going to go beyond posting on 4chan or 8chan. And as I demonstrated in my very first book, The Threat from Within on Islamist terrorism, there's no profile. There's no easy checklist. Well, if Phil Gurski shows these 6 signs, he's okay. Whereas if he shows these 8 signs, well, you better get a warrant to arrest him, kind of thing. Yep. But no, these forms of extremism exist in Canada. They are few and far between. But if you want your security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies to investigate all potential threats to national security and public safety, you have to give them the leeway to do so. And you can't start saying, we want you to focus on these forms and not those forms. Because again, as the history of terrorism in my book showed quite categorically, the threats come from all different directions. And some are religious in nature, some are political, and some are ideological. And they cover all aspects of the spectrum. And it will morph in future years. And I do not predict. I wouldn't be surprised, Jas, if, the more we talk about global warming and climate change, and the more people become angry at what they perceive as a lack of movement by governments to cut down on CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use, there will be more people that will entertain the use of violence to make their point.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of good points, and I think that what I saw throughout that time was exactly what you've been saying. There wasn't enough coverage for it, and we live here in Alberta, where there's so many hardworking men and women who go into those fields, and they leave Calgary, they might go up to Fort McMurray or a more remote place to work, and I think that when they don't see the coverage or the same amount of advocacy for that act of terrorism, like you said, which I fully agree with, I think the confidence of Canadians and those energy workers goes down.